Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, your guide through shadows and secrets. Here, every teacup trembles with hidden truths, and every smile may mask a crime. Settle in. The mystery is about to unfold. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a wealthy widow hosts her elite tea party. Untouched cakes, polite smiles, and a deadly secret lurking in plain sight. But when she collapses lifeless, clutching a lace handkerchief gifted by her dear friend, the room erupts in chaos. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with eyes sharper than a detective's blade. As she unravels hidden grudges, crippling debts, scandalous pasts, and a solicitor's shady schemes, the clues point to poison, absorbed through innocent dabs to the lips. Was it envy-fueled murder by the cousin, or a conspiracy among the guests? Dive into twists of betrayal and revelation. Will justice prevail, or will the killer sip tea unscathed? Stay hooked. The truth is deadlier than you think. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, a place where time seemed to linger like morning mist over the meadows. Its thatched cottages, with their gardens bursting in riotous colour, hid more than their share of human frailties. Ambitions thwarted, jealousies nursed, and secrets buried deep beneath the veneer of rural tranquility. On this crisp autumn morning, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest home, casting delicate patterns on the polished wooden floor. Seated in her favourite armchair by the window, Miss Marple's frail hands moved with rhythmic precision, her knitting needles producing a soft, almost hypnotic click-clack that accompanied her thoughts like an old, familiar tune. She was an elderly spinster, unassuming in her woolen cardigan and sensible skirt, yet her china blue eyes held a sharpness that belied her gentle demeanour. Village life had taught her much. She had seen the patterns of human behaviour repeat themselves endlessly, much like the stitches in her endless scarves and shawls. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. The postman, punctual as ever, delivering the day's mail with a cheerful greeting. Among the bills and circulars lay an envelope of fine cream paper, sealed with a wax crest that spoke of elegance and old-world propriety. Miss Marple slit it open with a letter knife, her movements deliberate. Inside was a card, its edges gilded, bearing the embossed address of Ashford Manor. The message was brief but formal. Mrs. Lavinia Ashford requested the pleasure of Miss Jane Marple's company at her weekly tea party that very afternoon, at 4 o'clock sharp. A faint smile touched Miss Marple's lips as she read it again, her mind already whirring like the gears of a well-oiled clock. "How very intriguing," she whispered to the empty room, her voice carrying a note of quiet excitement. Invitations from Mrs. Ashford were rare treasures, doled out to a closed circle of intimates. For someone like Miss Marple, who moved on the periphery of such society, this was akin to a summons from royalty, unexpected and therefore suspect. She set the card down and leaned back, adjusting her spectacles to peer out at the village green, where children played and villagers exchanged nods laden with unspoken judgments. Mrs. Ashford had arrived in St. Mary Mead some 3 years ago, a widow of substantial means, her fortune amassed from her husband's ventures in the shipping trade. He had perished at sea under circumstances whispered about in hushed tones. Officially a storm, but rumours hinted at debts and desperate measures. Now, ensconced in the grandeur of Ashford Manor, with its sprawling lawns and echoing halls, she hosted her teas with the air of a queen holding court. Yet, Miss Marple had heard tales from her network of informants, the maid, the grocer, the vicar's wife, of gatherings where civility masked undercurrents of malice. Guests left with smiles fixed like masks, but the air often crackled with unresolved tensions, alliances forged and broken over cucumber sandwiches. Why, then, this sudden outreach? Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to recent village gossip, a disputed will, a young relative's extravagant demands, a doctor's lingering visits that seemed more personal than professional. Could it be that Mrs. Ashford sensed trouble brewing and sought an impartial observer? Or was there something more sinister at play? A web being spun with Miss Marple, unwittingly caught in its threads. She tucked the invitation into the depths of her knitting basket, alongside balls of yarn that symbolized the tangled lives she so often unraveled. Rising with a purpose that belied her age, she smoothed her skirt and glanced at the clock. There was time yet to prepare, to recall faces, motives, and those small inconsistencies that often betrayed the guilty. As she made her way to the kitchen for a cup of tea, Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill, the quiet anticipation of a puzzle presenting itself. In St. Mary Mead, invitations were seldom just social calls. They were doors ajar, revealing glimpses of the darkness that lurked behind polished facades. And Jane Marple, with her unerring instinct for the extraordinary in the ordinary, was ready to step through. Chapter 2. The Parlor. As the clock in the village square chimed the hour of 3, Miss Jane Marple set out from her cottage, her black handbag clutched firmly in one hand, and a light shawl draped over her shoulders against the cooling autumn breeze. The path to Ashford Manor wound through lanes bordered by hedgerows heavy with blackberries, their thorny branches reaching out like fingers eager to snag secrets from passers-by. Miss Marple walked with a steady, unhurried gait, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel, allowing her mind to wander over the afternoon ahead. She had donned her best afternoon dress, a simple affair in lavender wool that spoke of quiet dignity rather than ostentation, and pinned a brooch of seed pearls at her throat, a memento from a long-ago adventure that had taught her much about the deceptions of the heart. The manor loomed into view as she crested a gentle hill, its silhouette etched against the fading light of the day. Ashford Manor was a testament to Victorian grandeur, built in the flush of the industrial age by some ambitious ancestor of the late Mr. Ashford. Its red brick facade, adorned with climbing ivy that turned fiery in the fall, concealed a labyrinth of rooms filled with antique furniture and portraits of stern-faced forebears. Tall chimneys pierced the sky, and the mullioned windows gleamed like watchful eyes, reflecting the scudding clouds above. Miss Marple paused at the wrought-iron gates, which stood ajar as if an expectant welcome, and noted the well-manicured drive sweeping up to the entrance. Everything about the place exuded wealth, but she detected a faint air of neglect, the ivy encroaching a bit too freely, perhaps, or the faint weathering on the stone lions flanking the steps. Money, she reflected, could preserve appearances, but it could not always hide the cracks beneath. A young maid, her cap slightly askew, and her apron starched to crisp perfection, opened the heavy oak door at Miss Marple's knock. "Miss Marple? Mrs. Ashford is expecting you in the parlour," she said with a quick curtsy, her voice carrying a trace of the local accent that spoke of generations tied to the land. As she led the way through the echoing hall, Miss Marple's eyes darted about, taking in the details. The grandfather clock ticking solemnly in the corner, its pendulum swinging like a metronome of fate. The Persian rugs underfoot, their patterns intricate and faded from years of footsteps, and the faint scent of beeswax polish, mingled with the heavier aroma of wood smoke from a distant fire. The house felt alive, yet somehow stifled, as if it held its breath in anticipation of revelations yet to come. The parlor door swung open, revealing a room that was the epitome of refined elegance, yet laced with an undercurrent of something indefinable. Tension, perhaps, or the echo of unspoken words. Sunlight streamed through the tall sash windows, filtered by chintz curtains patterned with roses and vines, casting a warm glow over the assembled company. The walls were panelled in dark oak, adorned with oil paintings of pastoral scenes that contrasted oddly with the urban origins of the Ashford fortune. A massive fireplace dominated one end, its mantel crowded with silver-framed photographs of smiling faces from happier times. Mrs. Ashford, with her late husband on a sun-drenched deck, perhaps during one of his fateful voyages. In the centre stood a low table, groaning under the weight of the tea service. A gleaming silver pot, delicate china cups rimmed in gold, and platters of sandwiches cut into precise triangles, alongside cakes iced in pastel shades that remained, curiously, untouched. The air was perfumed with the fragrance of freshly brewed Darjeeling, and the subtle hint of lavender from potpourri bowls scattered about. Mrs. Lavinia Ashford rose from her high-backed chair with a rustle of silk, her dress a shimmering cascade of dove-grey that accentuated her slender figure. She was a woman in her late 50s, her hair coiffed in an elegant chignon streaked with silver, and her face bearing the lines of both laughter and sorrow. Her smile, however, was brittle, like fine porcelain on the verge of cracking, and her eyes, dark and piercing, held a flicker of something Miss Marple could not quite place. Wariness, or perhaps a plea for understanding. "Miss Marple, how delightful that you could join us," she said, extending a gloved hand. Her voice was cultured, with the clipped precision of one accustomed to command, yet there was a warmth in it that seemed genuine, if strained. "Do come in and make yourself comfortable. We were just discussing the latest village fete. Such a charming affair, though I dare say the weather played havoc with the tents." Miss Marple accepted the handshake, noting the cool firmness of Mrs. Ashford's grip, and allowed herself to be guided to a plush armchair near the window. From this vantage, she could observe the room's occupants without drawing undue attention, her mild expression masking the keen scrutiny of her gaze. The guests were a small, select group, each positioned as if in a carefully staged tableau, their interactions polite but laced with an invisible thread of unease that tugged at Miss Marple's instincts like a loose stitch in her knitting. Seated nearest the fire was Dr. Harold Vance, a retired physician whose once imposing frame had softened with age, his cheeks flushed perhaps from the warmth or from the sherry he cradled in his hand. He wore a tweed suit that had seen better days, its elbows patched discreetly, and his fingers toyed incessantly with his cufflinks, gold ones engraved with initials that Miss Marple surmised were not his own. "Ah, Miss Marple," he boomed in a voice honed by years of bedside manner. I've heard much about your legendary green thumb. Tell me, how do you manage those prize roses in this fickle climate?" His eyes, behind thick spectacles, darted nervously as he spoke, and Miss Marple wondered at the source of his agitation. She recalled whispers from the village surgery. A malpractice suit years ago, hushed up through connections, possibly involving the Ashfords. Could gratitude bind him here, or was it something more binding, like debt or shared secrets? Beside him, perched on the edge of a settee like a bird ready to take flight, was Mrs. Clara Henshaw, a widow whose sharp features and sharper tongue were well known in St. Mary Mead. Her black mourning dress, though fashionable, clung to her with an air of perpetual grievance, and her hands, ungloved and ringless save for a plain gold band, clutched her teacup with white-knuckled intensity. She was the cousin of the late Mr. Ashford, Miss Marple remembered, and thus connected by blood to the fortune that now sustained this lavish lifestyle. "The fate was tolerable," Clara interjected with a sniff, her voice carrying a nasal edge that grated like chalk on slate. "Though I must say the judging was biased. My Victoria sponge was far superior to that overbaked monstrosity that took first prize." Her eyes flicked towards Mrs. Ashford with a gleam that spoke volumes. Envy, perhaps, or resentment over inheritances perceived as unjust. Miss Marple filed away the observation, noting how Clara's gaze lingered on the silver tea service as if appraising its value. Across the room, lounging with studied nonchalance in a wingback chair, was Miss Beatrice Lyle, a young heiress whose vivacious energy seemed at odds with the subdued atmosphere. Barely out of her 20s, she wore a frock of vibrant emerald that hugged her curves, her auburn hair cascading in waves that caught the light. Her laughter, when it came, was a trill that rang just a shade too loud, echoing off the panelled walls like a challenge. "Oh, Clara, you're too modest. Your sponge was divine, far better than mine, which collapsed like a soufflé in a draught." Beatrice's words were light, but her eyes held a calculating spark as she glanced at Mrs. Ashford, and Miss Marple detected the faint tremor in her hand as she set down her cup. Gossip had it that Beatrice was in debt, her inheritance squandered on London seasons and ill-advised investments, and that Mrs. Ashford had extended loans, generous but with strings attached. Was this gaiety a mask for desperation, or something more cunning? Completing the circle was Mr. Rupert Grayson, the solicitor, whose slick charm oozed like oil over water. Lean and dapper in a pinstriped suit, his hair pomaded to a sheen, he leaned forward with a smile that revealed perfect teeth. "Ladies, let's not dwell on culinary rivalries. Mrs. Ashford, your hospitality outshines any village event." His voice was smooth, persuasive, the tool of a man who dealt in contracts and confidences. Miss Marple's instincts prickled at his presence. Solicitors, in her experience, often navigated murky waters, and Grayson's firm handled the Ashford estate. Whispers suggested fees inflated, documents altered, nothing proven, but enough to warrant watchfulness. He caught her eye and nodded deferentially. "Miss Marple, a pleasure. I've admired your discretion in village matters." As the conversation flowed, Miss Marple sipped her tea, strong and hot, just as she liked it, and let her gaze roam, absorbing the nuances of the scene. The air was thick with polite tension, the kind that simmered beneath surface pleasantries, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. Mrs. Ashford, ever the gracious hostess, steered the talk towards safer shores. The upcoming Harvest Festival, the rector's latest sermon on charity. Yet even here, undercurrents surfaced. Dr. Vance mentioned a recent patient with a mysterious ailment, his cufflinks clicking as he gestured, and Clara's lips thinned in disapproval. "Charity begins at home," she murmured, her eyes on Mrs. Ashford's diamond brooch. Beatrice laughed again, too brightly, recounting a trip to Paris where she'd acquired a scandalous hat, but her fingers twisted a napkin into knots. It was then that Mrs. Ashford reached into her reticule and withdrew a delicate lace handkerchief, its edges embroidered with exquisite filigree that spoke of fine craftsmanship. She dabbed at her lips with it, a habitual gesture, Miss Marple noted, performed with the absent-minded grace of long practice. "This dear thing," Mrs. Ashford said, holding it up for admiration, "was a gift from Clara just last week." "So thoughtful, isn't it? The lace is from Brussels, I believe." She pressed it to her mouth once more, inhaling faintly, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the way Clara's expression shifted, a fleeting satisfaction perhaps, or triumph, masked as modesty. "I'm glad you like it, Lavinia," Clara replied, her voice even. "One must have little luxuries in these trying times." Miss Marple filed the moment away, her mind likening it to a stray thread in a tapestry, innocuous yet potentially unravelling. Why a handkerchief, and why now? Mrs. Ashford's habits were well known in the village. She was fastidious, often dabbing at her face during conversations, especially when animated. The gift seemed innocuous, but in Miss Marple's experience, the most dangerous weapons were those disguised as kindness. She turned her attention back to the group, engaging Dr. Vance in talk of herbal remedies, all the while observing how Rupert Grayson's eyes followed the handkerchief's path, his smile never wavering, but his posture stiffening imperceptibly. The clock on the mantel chimed 4:30, its bells tolling like a harbinger, and the conversation dipped into a lull. Beatrice rose to examine a vase of hothouse flowers, her heels clicking on the parquet floor, while Clara refilled her cup with deliberate slowness. Mrs. Ashford, handkerchief still in hand, proposed a toast to old friends and new acquaintances, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying a shadow of fatigue. Or was it foreboding? Miss Marple raised her cup, her senses alert, feeling the invisible web of motives tightening around the room. In this parlor of opulence, amid the clink of china and murmur of voices, she sensed the prelude to drama, the quiet gathering of forces that would soon erupt. And as the tea cooled in her saucer, she wondered which of these polished facades hid the heart of a killer. The discussion turned to literature, with Rupert suggesting a recent novel of intrigue that had captured London's attention. "It's all about deception and hidden poisons," he said with a chuckle, his eyes twinkling. Dr. Vance coughed awkwardly, adjusting his cufflinks yet, again, while Beatrice exclaimed over the plot's twists. Clara remained silent, her gaze fixed on the untouched cakes, as if they held some private jest. Mrs. Ashford laughed softly, dabbing her lips once more with the lace. Miss Marple, ever the observer, noted the faint scent wafting from the fabric, subtle, almost floral, but with an acrid undertone that prickled her nostrils. Perfume, or something else? She made a mental note to inquire later, her curiosity piqued. As the afternoon wore on, snippets of personal history emerged, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered across the table. Dr. Vance spoke of his retirement, hinting at health issues that had forced his hand, his voice laced with regret. "One misses the challenge of diagnosis," he admitted, glancing at Mrs. Ashford with what might have been gratitude. Had she aided him in some professional crisis? Clara, warming to the theme, recounted her own widowhood, her words sharp with bitterness over lost opportunities. "Family should stick together," she said pointedly, her eyes on the hostess. Beatrice, ever effervescent, diverted with tales of society balls, but her laughter faltered when money was mentioned, her cheeks flushing. Rupert Grayson, sensing the shift, interjected with legal anecdotes, his charm deflecting deeper probes. Yet Miss Marple detected the artifice, the way his anecdotes skirted personal details, focusing instead on abstract justice. She engaged him gently, asking about estate laws, and noted his quick deflection. The room's atmosphere grew heavier, the sunlight slanting lower, casting long shadows that danced like spectres on the walls. Mrs. Ashford, perhaps sensing the need for levity, suggested a game of cards. But the proposal fell flat, met with polite demurrals. Instead, the talk circled back to village affairs, the new curate's enthusiasm, the post office's inefficiencies. Miss Marple contributed mildly, her comments drawing out revelations. Beatrice's recent trip to London, ostensibly for shopping, but perhaps for meetings with creditors. Clara's visit to a chemist for nerve tonics. Dr. Vance's interest in toxicology texts. Each detail slotted into her mental ledger, building a picture of interconnected lives fraught with hidden strains. By 5 o'clock, the tea had grown tepid, the sandwiches curling at the edges, yet no one touched the cakes, as if an unspoken taboo hung over them. Mrs. Ashford dabbed her lips again, the handkerchief now slightly crumpled, and Miss Marple watched closely, her instincts humming. The gesture was so automatic, so intimate, pressing the lace not just to dab, but to linger against the skin. Clara's eyes followed the motion, her expression inscrutable. Was it pride in her gift or anticipation of its effect? Miss Marple's thoughts raced, drawing parallels to past cases. A poisoned glove in a distant county, a tainted letter in her own youth. Poisons were insidious, requiring knowledge and opportunity, and here, in this circle, both abounded. Dr. Vance's medical background, Clara's family ties, Beatrice's debts, Rupert's legal acumen, all potential ingredients in a deadly brew. Yet she chided herself for speculation. Evidence was key, and so far, only vibes of discord. As the clock ticked onward, the group's dynamics shifted subtly. Alliances forming in glances, rivalries in silences. Beatrice flirted lightly with Rupert, her hand brushing his arm, while Clara watched with narrowed eyes. Dr. Vance excused himself briefly, returning with a pallor that suggested more than a call of nature. Mrs. Ashford, ever composed, refilled cups, her handkerchief tucked away but not forgotten. Miss Marple, content in her corner, let the scene unfold, her presence a catalyst for unguarded moments. She knew that in such gatherings the truth often slipped out in the pauses, the averted eyes, the forced smiles. And as the shadows lengthened, she felt the inexorable pull of impending revelation, the parlor transforming from a haven of civility into a stage set for tragedy. Chapter 3. The sudden tragedy. The clock on the mantelpiece, an ornate affair of gilded bronze, struck 5 with a series of resonant chimes that seemed to reverberate through the parlor. as if sounding a warning that went unheeded. The conversation, which had meandered through village gossip and literary musings, faltered momentarily, and a hush settled over the room, broken only by the faint clink of a teaspoon against china as Mrs. Ashford stirred her tea. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her unobtrusive corner by the window, felt the shift in the air, a tightening like the moment before a storm breaks. Her fingers rested lightly on her saucer, but her eyes, sharp and alert beneath their mild exterior, darted from face to face, cataloguing every nuance of expression. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface of the tea party was now palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. Mrs. Lavinia Ashford, at the head of the gathering, seemed momentarily distracted. Her hand, still holding the lace handkerchief gifted by Clara Henshaw, paused mid-air, and a faint flush crept up her neck. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips once more, a gesture so habitual it drew no comment from the others, yet Miss Marple's attention lingered on it, her mind turning over the curious scent she had detected earlier. Floral, yet with a bitter edge that was not quite perfume. Mrs. Ashford's voice, when she spoke, carried a slight tremor, though her words were as polished as ever. "I do think we should plan a little charity event for the church restoration," she said, her eyes flickering towards Dr. Vance. "Don't you agree, Harold? Your medical society might contribute Dr. Harold Vance." His face, already flushed from sherry or nerves, nodded absently, his fingers fumbling with his cufflinks, in a rhythm that betrayed unease. "Quite right, Lavinia." "A worthy cause," he mumbled, but his gaze darted toward Fishsund door, as if he longed to escape the room's oppressive atmosphere. Miss Marple noted the beads of sweat on his brow, unusual for a man seated so near the fire's warmth. Was it guilt, fear, or merely the strain of a social gathering that sat ill with his temperament? She recalled the village whispers of his past, a patient lost under questionable circumstances, a lawsuit buried with Mrs. Ashford's influence. His presence here, she mused, was no accident. Gratitude could bind as tightly as blackmail. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, her posture rigid on the settee, set her teacup down with a deliberate clink, her lips pursed as if suppressing a retort. "Charity is all very well," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a shard of glass. "But one must ensure it reaches the right hands. Too often funds are misdirected." Her eyes, cold and assessing, fixed on Mrs. Ashford's diamond brooch, a glittering heirloom that seemed to mock Clara's own modest adornments. The barb was subtle, but unmistakable, and Miss Marple caught the tightening of Mrs. Ashford's jaw, a fleeting crack in her hostess's composure. Clara's resentment, rooted in the belief that the Ashford fortune should have been hers by right of kinship, was a thread Miss Marple intended to tug further. Miss Beatrice Lyle, ever the butterfly flitting from topic to topic, laughed, a high tinkling sound that grated more than it charmed. "Oh, Clara, you're so practical, I say. Let's have a gala, with dancing and champagne. It would raise spirits as well as funds." Her emerald dress shimmered as she leaned forward, her eyes bright with a feverish intensity that belied her carefree words. Miss Marple observed the tremor in Beatrice's hand as she reached for a sandwich, only to withdraw it untouched. The girls' debts were the talk of St. Mary Mead's drawing rooms. Loans from Mrs. Ashford, extended with a smile, but likely with expectations of repayment in loyalty or silence. Beatrice's vivacity, Miss Marple suspected, was a performance, a mask for desperation that could drive one to reckless acts. Mr. Rupert Grayson, the solicitor, leaned back in his chair, his smile as polished as his patent leather shoes. "A gala sounds splendid, Miss Lyle, but one must consider the legalities, permits, donations, trusts." His voice was smooth, almost hypnotic, but Miss Marple detected a calculating edge, as if he weighed every word for its effect. His eyes, when they met hers, held a flicker of amusement, as if he recognized her as a fellow observer of human nature. Yet there was something guarded in his posture, a wariness that suggested he played a deeper game. His firm's handling of the Ashford estate gave him access to secrets and opportunities that Miss Marple intended to explore. A solicitor, she knew, could manipulate more than ledgers. Wills and trusts were fertile ground for mischief. The conversation continued, a delicate dance of pleasantries and veiled barbs, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn back to Mrs. Ashford. The widow's movements had grown sluggish, her hand trembling slightly as she raised her teacup. The handkerchief, now tucked into her sleeve, was momentarily forgotten, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on it. She recalled a case from her youth, a poisoned letter, its ink laced with a subtle toxin absorbed through the skin. Could such a method be at play here? The thought was speculative, but Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts, honed by years of watching the quiet dramas of village life unfold. The clock's hands crept toward 10 minutes past 5, and the light in the parlor had shifted, the golden glow giving way to the cooler hues of dusk. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across the oak-panelled walls, lending an almost theatrical quality to the scene. Mrs. Ashford, perhaps sensing the lull, rose to replenish the tea, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves. "Do let me pour you another, Miss Marple," she said, her voice bright but strained. She reached for the silver teapot, but her hand faltered, and the pot wobbled, sending a few drops splashing onto the pristine tablecloth. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she murmured, her smile wavering as she pressed the handkerchief to her lips once more. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. The gesture, so innocuous, so habitual, nagged at her like a dropped stitch. She glanced at Clara, whose eyes were fixed on Mrs. Ashford with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Beatrice, meanwhile, had fallen silent, her fingers twisting the hem of her napkin into knots, while Dr. Vance's cufflinks clicked faster, a nervous metronome. Rupert Grayson alone seemed unperturbed, sipping his tea with studied calm, though his gaze flicked toward the handkerchief with a curiosity that mirrored Miss Marple's own. Then, without warning, the delicate balance of the room shattered. Mrs. Ashford's teacup slipped from her grasp, striking the floor with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. The fine china splintered, tea pooling on the Persian rug like dark blood. She swayed in her chair, her face paling to a ghastly white, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something deeper. Fear, perhaps, or realization. Her hand clutched at her throat, the handkerchief falling to her lap, and with a soft, strangled gasp, she collapsed forward, her body slumping onto the rug with a dull thud that seemed to freeze time itself. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, as if the room held its breath. Then chaos erupted. Beatrice let out a scream, high and piercing, her hands flying to her face in a gesture that seemed rehearsed for a stage. "Lavinia!" she cried, stumbling to her feet, her dress catching on the edge of the settee. Dr. Vance was at Mrs. Ashford's side in an instant, his medical instincts overriding his earlier agitation. He knelt beside her, his fingers pressing against her wrist, then her neck, searching for a pulse. His face, already flushed, drained of colour, and his voice, when it came, was a hoarse whisper. "She's gone," he said, the words hanging in the air like a verdict. "No pulse! She's dead." Clara Henshaw remained rooted to her seat, her teacup still in hand, her face a mask of shock that Miss Marple found oddly composed, as if she had anticipated this moment. Her eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of something else. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief. Rupert Grayson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his gaze darting toward the door, as if calculating the distance to escape. "Good God!" he muttered, loosening his tie, his charm momentarily forsaken. Beatrice's sobs grew louder, theatrical in their intensity, though Miss Marple noted the absence of tears in her eyes. Miss Marple herself remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her mind racing. She observed the scene as if it were a tableau vivant, each figure frozen in a pose that revealed more than their words ever could. Dr. Vance's trembling hands as he rose from the body, Clara's rigid stillness, Beatrice's exaggerated grief, Rupert's fleeting glance towards the exit, all were pieces of a puzzle that had just taken a deadly turn. She noted the handkerchief, now crumpled on the rug beside Mrs. Ashford's lifeless form, its lace edges stark against the rich colours of the carpet. It seemed to beckon, a silent clue in a room now filled with noise. The maid, alerted by Beatrice's scream, burst into the parlour, her cap slipping further as she gasped at the sight. "Madam!" she cried, rushing to Mrs. Ashford's side, only to be gently restrained by Dr. Vance. "Fetch the constable, Mary," he said, his voice regaining some authority, "and telephone for Dr. Haydock at once." The maid nodded, her eyes wide with panic, and fled the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The parlour descended into a flurry of activity, yet Miss Marple remained an island of calm, her eyes missing nothing. She rose quietly, moving closer to the body under the pretence of offering assistance, though her true purpose was to observe. Mrs. Ashford's face, even in death, retained a trace of elegance, but her lips were faintly blue, and her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, as if fixed on some unseen truth. The handkerchief lay inches from her hand, and Miss Marple resisted the urge to touch it, knowing the importance of preserving evidence. Instead, she noted its position, the way it had fallen, as if discarded in a final, futile gesture. The constable, a sturdy man named Sergeant Polk, arrived within minutes, his heavy boots thudding on the oak floor. He was followed shortly by Dr. Haydock, the village physician, whose brisk efficiency contrasted with the room's lingering shock. The two men set about their tasks, Polk questioning the guests in a gruff, methodical manner while Haydock examined the body with a frown that deepened with each passing moment. "No obvious signs of trauma," he muttered, his fingers probing gently. "No marks, no wounds. The tea, perhaps?" He gestured toward the table, where the silver pot and scattered cups stood like silent witnesses. Polk, taking charge, ordered the food and drink to be secured for analysis. "Poison's likely," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of experience. "We'll have the lot tested. Tea, sandwiches, cakes." He glanced at the untouched platters, his brow furrowing. Odd that. Not a crumb eaten, Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, nodded to herself. The untouched food was indeed curious, but her attention was drawn elsewhere, to the handkerchief, which Polk had overlooked in his focus on the edibles. She stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Sergeant, might I suggest examining the handkerchief?" Mrs. Ashford used it frequently during the tea. Polk turned, his expression a mix of skepticism and irritation. "A handkerchief, Miss Marple?" "It's just a lady's trifle." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple's smile remained serene, her eyes twinkling with a knowledge he did not yet share. "Perhaps," she said gently, "but trifles can be telling. I've known cases where the smallest things held the greatest secrets." Polk grunted, unconvinced, but he made a note to have it collected, if only to humour the old lady, whose reputation for insight was beginning to precede her. As the constable and doctor continued their work, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities. The handkerchief with its faint acrid scent was the key. She was certain of it. Poison could be administered in ways subtler than food or drink, and Mrs. Ashford's habit of pressing the lace to her lips offered a perfect vector. But who had the knowledge, the motive, the opportunity? Clara, with her gift and her grudge. Dr. Vance, with his medical expertise and shadowed past. Beatrice, driven by debt to desperate measures, or Rupert, whose legal acumen might conceal darker ambitions. The guests were herded into the drawing room to await further questioning, their faces a gallery of emotions, shock, fear, and in some cases, calculation. Beatrice's sobs had subsided into hiccuping gasps, though her eyes remained dry. Clara sat ramrod straight, her lips a thin line, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Vance paced, his cufflinks silent now, as if his nervous energy had been spent. Rupert leaned against a bookcase, his composure regained but his eyes watchful, like a cat tracking a mouse. Miss Marple, excused for the moment, lingered near the parlour door, her presence unassuming yet purposeful. She overheard Polk muttering to Haydock about the likelihood of cyanide, given the blue tinge to Mrs. Ashford's lips, and the suddenness of her collapse. Cyanide, Miss Marple knew, could be absorbed through mucus, membranes, a method both subtle and deadly. The handkerchief, soaked and dried, would leave no obvious trace until used, a perfect weapon for a patient killer. But patience required planning, and planning required motive. As the evening deepened, the manor's grandeur seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening like fingers reaching for the truth. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the guests, each a thread in the tapestry of this tragedy. Clara's envy, Beatrice's debts, Vance's past, Grayson's secrets, each offered a motive, but the handkerchief pointed most directly to Clara. Yet Miss Marple cautioned herself against haste. The truth, like a good knit, required careful stitching, not reckless pulls. She resolved to watch, to listen, to let the guilty betray themselves as they so often did in the quiet moments after a crime. The parlour, now a crime scene, was cordoned off, the silver tea service and untouched cakes sealed in bags for the laboratory. The handkerchief, too, was finally collected, though Polk handled it with the skepticism of a man who trusted only what he could see. Miss Marple, however, saw more than most, and as she prepared to leave the manor, her mind was already weaving the next steps. The tragedy had begun, but the story was far from over, and in St. Mary Mead, the smallest clues often led to the greatest revelations. Chapter 4. the guests' secrets. The morning after Mrs. Ashford's tragic collapse dawned grey and heavy. The sky over St. Mary Mead cloaked in a shroud of low clouds that mirrored the village's sombre mood. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp chill that seeped through her cottage windows, sat by her fire with a cup of tea, her knitting needles idle for once as her mind stitched together the fragments of the previous day's events. The parlour at Ashford Manor had been a stage, and the actors, Dr. Vance, Clara Henshaw, Beatrice Lyle, and Rupert Grayson, had played their parts with varying degrees of skill. But the handkerchief, that delicate scrap of lace, remained the focal point of her thoughts. Its faint acrid scent and Clara's subtle triumph haunting her like a half-remembered melody. To unravel this mystery, she knew, required more than observation. It demanded the careful gathering of threads from the village's rich tapestry of gossip and secrets. Miss Marple donned her tweed coat and sturdy hat, her black handbag tucked under her arm, and set out on her customary morning walk. The village was stirring, its cobblestone lanes alive with the clatter of milk bottles and the chatter of early risers. But an undercurrent of unease rippled through the air. News of Mrs. Ashford's death had spread like wildfire, fanned by the maid's breathless account at the post office, and the butcher's whispered speculations. Miss Marple's destination was the village shop, a hub of information where Mrs. Giddings, the postmistress, presided with an ear for gossip that rivaled Miss Marple's own knack for observation. The shop, with its jumble of tinned goods and neatly stacked letters, was a treasure trove of human nature, where confidences were traded as freely as pennies. Mrs. Giddings, her round face framed by a halo of grey curls, looked up from sorting the morning's post as Miss Marple entered. The bell above the door jingling softly. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a dreadful business at the manor!" she exclaimed, her eyes bright with the thrill of calamity. "Poor Mrs. Ashford taken so sudden-like. They're saying poison, but the cakes weren't touched, not a one. What do you make of it?" Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, inviting Miss Marple to share in the village's collective curiosity. Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of mild concern, though her mind was as sharp as a needle. "Very shocking indeed, Mrs. Giddings. I was there, you know, and it was quite unexpected. But I wonder, have you heard anything about the guests? Mrs. Henshaw, perhaps, or Miss Lyle?" She posed the question lightly, as if it were an afterthought, knowing full well that Mrs. Giddings needed little prompting to spill her store of tidbits. The postmistress leaned forward, her apron crinkling. "Well, now that you mention it, there's plenty to tell. That Clara Henshaw, oh, she's a bitter one, mark my words. Always thought she was owed more than she got when her cousin, Mr. Ashford, passed. The will, you see, left everything to Lavinia, and Clara's been nursing a grudge ever since. My sister's friend, who cleans for Clara, says she's got a drawer full of old letters from Mr. Ashford, hinting at promises never kept. And just last month, Clara was seen in London, coming out of a chemist's shop with a parcel. Nerve tonics, she said, but who needs tonics in such quantity? Mrs. Giddings raised an eyebrow, her meaning clear. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind filing away the chemist's visit alongside Clara's intense gaze at the tea party. A grudge over an inheritance was a potent motive, and access to chemicals suggested opportunity. "And Miss Lyle," she prompted gently, adjusting her shawl as if to ward off the chill. Mrs. Giddings's voice dropped lower, her eyes darting to the door to ensure no eavesdroppers lingered. "Beatrice Lyle's in a right mess, if you ask me. That girl's been living beyond her means for years. London parties, fancy dresses, and those risky investments in some mining venture that went bust. Word is, Mrs. Ashford lent her a tidy sum to cover her debts, but Beatrice hasn't paid back a penny. My cousin's boy, who works at the bank, says Beatrice's accounts are in the red, and Mrs. Ashford was pressing her to settle up. Threatened to cut her off, they say, unless Beatrice agreed to certain arrangements." The postmistress paused, her lips pursed, leaving the nature of those arrangements to Miss Marple's imagination. The mention of debts and pressure added weight to Beatrice's theatrical performance at the tea. Her nervous gestures and forced laughter now cast in a new light. Miss Marple recalled the girl's fleeting glances at Mrs. Ashford, tinged with both charm and desperation. A cornered debtor, she knew, could be as dangerous as a scorned heir. "Most interesting," she murmured, her tone encouraging Mrs. Giddings to continue. "And then there's Dr. Vance," the postmistress went on, warming to her task. "He's not been the same since that business years ago. You know, the malpractice case. A patient died under his care, some said from a wrong dose, and it nearly ruined him. Mrs. Ashford stepped in, used her influence to hush it up, got the family to drop the suit. He's been grateful ever since, always at her beck and call. But there's talk he's got debts of his own. Gambling, they say, at the races. My nephew saw him at the station last week, looking furtive, carrying a medical bag stuffed with papers, not instruments. Odd for a retired doctor, don't you think?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Dr. Vance's nervous cufflink fiddling and his pallor after Mrs. Ashford's collapse took on new significance. A man in debt, with a tarnished past and a medical background, had both motive and means. Could gratitude have soured into resentment, or was he protecting a secret tied to his benefactress? "And Mr. Grayson?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed, steering the conversation to the final guest. Mrs. Giddings sniffed, her disapproval evident. "That Rupert Grayson's too smooth by half. Solicitor for the Ashford estate, and a fine job he's made of it, for himself, that is. My brother-in-law's friend, who works in the city, says Grayson's firm charges fees that'd make your eyes water, and there's talk of discrepancies in the accounts. Nothing proven, mind you. But Mrs. Ashford was sharp. She'd have noticed if he was skimming. And just last week, the grocer's boy overheard Grayson arguing with her in the manor garden. Something about adjustments to the will. He looked proper rattled when he left Miss Marple, thanked Mrs. Giddings, purchasing a packet of needles as a pretext for her visit, and stepped back into the drizzle, her mind alight with possibilities. The village's gossip, often dismissed as idle chatter, was to her a map of human motives, each rumour a coordinate pointing to hidden truths. Clara's envy, Beatrice's debts, Vance's past, Grayson's greed, each guest carried a burden that could have tipped into murder. Yet the handkerchief, that delicate instrument of death, pointed most directly to Clara, whose gift had been so intimately tied to Mrs. Ashford's final moments. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was pruning her roses in the garden. A kind-hearted woman with a penchant for tea and confidences, she welcomed Miss Marple with a warm smile and an offer of biscuits. Over a steaming pot, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the tea party's guests, her questions cloaked in neighbourly concern. Mrs. Clement, ever eager to share, confirmed much of Mrs. Giddings's account, but added a new thread. Clara had been seen visiting the manor late at night, weeks before, her manner secretive. "The gardener mentioned it," Mrs. Clement said, her voice low. "He thought it odd, Clara being family, but sneaking about like a thief." And she asked after Mrs. Ashford's habits, her routines, her little quirks. Said it was for a surprise, but it gave him the chills. This revelation tightened the knot in Miss Marple's mind. Clara's knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's habit of dabbing her lips with a handkerchief suggested premeditation, a plan tailored to exploit a personal tic. Yet Miss Marple cautioned herself against tunnel vision. The others had their own shadows. Mrs. Clement also mentioned Beatrice's recent flirtations with Rupert Grayson, observed at a village dance. "Bold as brass," she said, but there was a desperation in her eyes, like she was grasping at straws. And Mr. Grayson, well, he's not one to miss an opportunity, is he? The vicarage visit yielded another clue. Dr. Vance had been spotted at the local library, poring over a volume on toxicology, a curious choice for a retired physician. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Clement and continued her walk, her steps taking her past the churchyard, where the gravestones stood like silent sentinels. The village was a microcosm of human nature, its secrets buried shallowly beneath the surface, and Miss Marple was adept at digging them up. Her final stop was the bakery, where young Tom, the delivery boy, was sweeping the stoop. A few kind words and a shilling loosened his tongue, and he recounted delivering a parcel to Clara's cottage. A small box from a London apothecary, labelled as herbal remedies, but handled with unusual care. By midday, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind a whirl of connections. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, the click of her needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The handkerchief remained the linchpin, its lace edges a delicate trap. Clara's resentment and her chemist's visit suggested she was the architect, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. Beatrice's debts could have driven her to collude, perhaps with Grayson, whose legal manoeuvres might conceal a darker intent. And Vance, with his medical knowledge and compromised past, could have supplied the means, willingly or under duress. She recalled a case from her youth, a poisoned scarf, its fibres imbued with a toxin that killed through prolonged contact. The method was rare but effective, requiring intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. Mrs. Ashford's frequent use of the handkerchief, so proudly displayed by Clara, fit the pattern perfectly. Yet the question of access to such a poison nagged at her. Clara was no scientist, but she was resourceful, and London's less reputable chemists were known to cater to discreet clients. Could she have acted alone, or was there a confederate among the guests? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the manor itself, its opulence a stark contrast to the motives it concealed. She resolved to visit again, under the guise of offering condolences, to speak with the maid, Mary, who had been privy to the household's rhythms. Servants, she knew, saw more than their employers realized, their quiet presence a window into hidden truths. Mary might recall Clara's late-night visit, or perhaps a conversation that shed light on the other's movements. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple took a turn in her garden, her eyes on the roses, but her mind elsewhere. The village's whispers had painted a picture of greed, desperation, and betrayal, each guest a potential player in a deadly game. Clara's envy was the strongest thread, but Beatrice's debts, Vance's past, and Grayson's opportunism wove a complex pattern. The handkerchief, with its faint discoloration and acrid scent, was the key, but its story was incomplete. Miss Marple knew that truth, like a good knit, required patience. Each stitch carefully placed, each clue carefully weighed. She returned indoors, her resolve firm. The afternoon's gleanings had deepened the mystery, but they had also illuminated the path forward. Tomorrow she would speak to Mary, and perhaps to Dr. Haydock, whose expertise might confirm her suspicions about the handkerchief's poison. For now, she resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome, each stitch a step closer to unravelling the secrets of Ashford Manor. In St. Mary Mead, the smallest whispers carried the weight of truth, and Miss Marple was listening. Chapter 5. The Handkerchief's Clue. The second day after the tragic events at Ashford Manor broke with a deceptive calm, the sun piercing through the thinning clouds to cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead. Yet beneath this serene facade, the village pulsed with the quiet fervour of speculation, whispers threading through the lanes like ivy on a crumbling wall. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the rhythms of her surroundings, rose early, her mind already entangled in the web of the previous day's events. The handkerchief, that innocuous square of lace, so casually wielded by Mrs. Ashford, so pointedly gifted by Clara Henshaw, had become the lodestar of her inquiries. It was not mere chance that drew her attention to it. In her long years of observing the frailties of human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the most lethal deceptions often hid in the most delicate disguises. She breakfasted lightly on toast and marmalade, her thoughts turning over the guests' secrets unearthed the day before. Clara's festering resentment, Beatrice's desperate debts, Dr. Vance's shadowed history, and Rupert Grayson's slippery dealings each offered fertile ground for suspicion. But the handkerchief, with its intimate connection to the victim, whispered of a method both elegant and insidious. Poison, Miss Marple mused, need not thunder like a gunshot. It could creep like mist, absorbed unnoticed through the skin. To confirm her suspicions, she needed access to the evidence, and for that, she turned to the one man in authority who might listen to an old lady's intuition. Inspector Craddock, a tall, no-nonsense figure from the county force, had been summoned to oversee the investigation, his presence a stark contrast to the village constable's bumbling efficiency. Miss Marple had encountered him before, in a matter involving a poisoned wedding cake, and knew him to be a man of keen mind, if somewhat hampered by official procedure. She penned a brief note, her handwriting neat and unassuming. Dear Inspector, I was present at the tea and observed certain details that may assist. Might I call upon you at the manor this morning? Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. Dispatching it with the postboy, she awaited a reply, confident that her reputation would open the door. The response came swiftly. Borne by the same lad. Permission granted, with a suggestion to meet at 10 o'clock. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, a modest affair trimmed with violets, and set out, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the flagstones. The walk to Ashford Manor allowed her to absorb the village's mood, curtains twitching at windows, knots of women huddled at garden gates, their conversations halting as she passed. Poor soul, one murmured. But Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of excitement, the thrill of tragedy that bound a community in shared speculation. The manor gates stood open, flanked by constables who nodded deferentially as she approached. Inspector Craddock awaited her in the library, a room of leather-bound volumes and heavy drapes that smelled of aged paper and faint tobacco. He rose from behind a desk cluttered with reports, his face lined with the fatigue of a sleepless night. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his tone polite but edged with curiosity. "Your note intrigued me. You've a knack for these matters, as I recall. What is it you wish to see?" "The handkerchief, Inspector," she replied simply, settling into a chair with the grace of one accustomed to being underestimated. Mrs. Ashford used it repeatedly during the tea, pressing it to her lips in a most habitual manner. It fell beside her when she collapsed, and I believe it warrants closer scrutiny. Craddock's brow furrowed, but he did not dismiss her outright. "The sergeant mentioned your suggestion. We've sent samples of the food and tea to the lab. Preliminary tests show nothing amiss. The handkerchief was bagged as a formality, but it's just fabric, Miss Marple. No residue visible to the eye." "Precisely," she said, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "The eye sees what it is trained to see, but the trained mind discerns patterns. May I examine it? Under supervision, of course." After a moment's hesitation, Craddock acquiesced, summoning a constable to retrieve the evidence bag from the parlor, now sealed as a crime scene. The room itself, when Miss Marple glimpsed it through the half-open door, bore the marks of intrusion. Chalk outlines on the rug, fingerprint powder dusting the table, the air heavy with the scent of officialdom. The handkerchief arrived in a sterile envelope, its lace edges pristine save for a subtle crumple from handling. Craddock laid it on the desk, gloved hands careful, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze as piercing as a magnifying glass. The fabric was exquisite, fine Brussels lace, embroidered with tiny forget-me-nots in silver thread. A gift that spoke of calculated affection. Miss Marple turned it over gently, her fingers hovering rather than touching, noting the even weave and the faint perfume that clung to it. Lavender, perhaps, masking something sharper. Then, in the corner where the edge met the center, she spotted it. A discoloration, no larger than a pinprick. A shadowy bloom that might escape all but the most vigilant eye. It was yellowish, almost imperceptible against the cream lace, but to Miss Marple it was a beacon. "Here," she murmured, pointing without contact, a faint stain, as if from a solution that has dried unevenly. "And see how the threads around it are slightly stiffened. Not from starch, I think, but from a chemical residue." Craddock peered closer, his skepticism waning. "Could be anything, tea, perfume, but I'll have it tested properly. What makes you suspect poison in it, specifically?" Miss Marple leaned back, her voice soft and measured, drawing him into her reasoning as if sharing a confidence. "Mrs. Ashford had a peculiar habit, Inspector, one I observed throughout the tea. She would dab her lips with it frequently, not just to wipe away crumbs, but almost as a comfort, pressing it there lingeringly. It was automatic like breathing. If one knew of that habit, and Clara Henshaw, as her cousin certainly did, one might exploit it. Poison need not be ingested. Certain toxins can be absorbed through the mucous membranes of the mouth. A handkerchief soaked in such a substance, then dried, would appear harmless until used." The inspector rubbed his chin, his mind turning over her words. Cyanide, perhaps? Haydock mentioned the symptoms match. Rapid collapse, cyanosis. But how would someone like Mrs. Henshaw obtain it? She's no chemist. That remains to be seen, Miss Marple replied, her tone enigmatic. But motives we have in abundance, as I learned yesterday from village sources. Clara's envy of the inheritance, for one. Yet I would not rule out accomplices. Thank you for indulging me, Inspector. With your permission, I shall consult Dr. Haydock to confirm the feasibility of such a method. Craddock nodded, sealing the handkerchief away with renewed interest. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. I'll keep you informed of the lab results. In the meantime, tread carefully. These folk are on edge. Miss Marple departed the manor with a sense of progress, the discoloration etched in her mind like a signature on a forgery. The walk to Dr. Haydock's surgery invigorated her, the crisp air clearing her thoughts. The village doctor, a bluff man in his 60s with a mane of white hair and a practice built on generations of trust, greeted her warmly in his consulting room, shelves lined with medical tomes and jars of herbs. Jane, what brings you here? Not ailing, I hope? No, doctor, but seeking your wisdom on a delicate matter, she said, settling into the patient's chair. She recounted the events of the tea, the collapse, and her examination of the handkerchief, omitting no detail save the village gossip that coloured her suspicions. Haydock listened intently, his pipe forgotten in his hand, his expression shifting from sympathy to professional intrigue. Absorption through the lips, eh? He mused, tapping his desk. Quite possible, Jane. Certain cyanides, prussic acid for instance, can penetrate mucous membranes rapidly. A concentrated solution applied to fabric, allowed to evaporate, would leave crystals or residues that dissolve on contact with saliva. The victim might feel a slight bitterness at first, dismissed as the tea's tannin, then the full effect. Convulsions, respiratory failure within minutes, nasty business, and clever, leaves no taste in food or drink to arouse suspicion. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers steepled. And the discoloration I observed, could it be from such a compound? Undoubtedly, Haydock replied, his eyes narrowing. Cyanides often leave a faint yellow or brownish mark, especially on porous materials like lace. The lab will confirm, but if it's there, it's damning. Who do you suspect? One of the guests? Clara Henshaw, primarily, Miss Marple admitted, her voice steady. The handkerchief was her gift, presented with such pride. She knew Lavinia's habits intimately. Family ties run deep, and grudges deeper still. But Clara is no chemist. Where would she obtain such a poison? Haydock puffed on his pipe, exhaling a cloud of aromatic smoke. Not from me, that's certain. But London has its underbelly. Disreputable chemists catering to the desperate. Or perhaps through a contact. Vance, the retired doctor, comes to mind. His background in medicine. He might know sources, even if unwillingly. The mention of Dr. Vance stirred Miss Marple's thoughts. His nervous demeanour at the tea, the cufflinks' incessant clicking, now seemed less eccentricity and more evasion. A point to consider, she said. Thank you, Doctor. Your confirmation strengthens the case. The truth will out, as it always does. Leaving the surgery, Miss Marple's mind raced ahead, piecing together the puzzle's edges. The handkerchief was no longer a trifle. It was a weapon, its clue a thread leading straight to Clara. Yet questions lingered. The procurement of the poison, the precision of its application, the absence of accomplices. She recalled Beatrice's trembling hands, Rupert's watchful eyes. Could one of them have assisted, motivated by their own stakes in Mrs. Ashford's fortune? Her path home took her past Clara Henshaw's cottage, a modest dwelling on the village outskirts, its garden overgrown with weeds that spoke of neglect. The curtains were drawn, but a flicker of movement within caught Miss Marple's eye. Clara, perhaps pacing in solitude, her composure cracking under the weight of guilt. Miss Marple did not approach. Observation from afar was often more revealing. Instead, she noted the postman's delivery. A letter from London, sealed with wax that gleamed ominously in the sunlight. Correspondence from a chemist, perhaps. Or a confession of complicity. By afternoon, Miss Marple was back in her cottage, the familiar click of her knitting needles resuming as she pondered her next move. The handkerchief's clue had illuminated the method, but the why and how demanded deeper probing. She decided on a subtle approach, inviting the maid, Mary, for tea the following day. Servants saw the unvarnished truth, their accounts often the key to locked doors. As she knit, her mind wove scenarios, Clara alone in her resentment, or entangled with Vance's desperation, Beatrice's folly, Grayson's cunning. The village with its labyrinth of alliances and animosities held the answers. And Miss Marple was patient, her instincts guiding her like a compass through fog. The evening brought a knock at her door, the inspector bearing preliminary lab news. "The handkerchief test's positive for cyanide residue," he said, his voice grave. "Faint, but unmistakable. The food and tea are clean. You've hit the mark, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly, her eyes alight. Then the net tightens. "But we must tread softly. The spider may yet spin another web." As Craddock departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the needle's rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the storm brewing. The handkerchief's clue had cracked the case open, but the heart of the mystery, Clara's hand in the deed and the shadows behind it, remained to be unveiled. In St. Mary Mead, secrets surfaced like bubbles in a still pond, and Miss Marple waited, ever vigilant, for the next ripple. Chapter 6. The Unravelling. The third day since Mrs. Lavinia Ashford's untimely death dawned with a restless energy. The air in St. Mary Mead thick with the scent of rain and the murmur of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her modest dining table, sipped her morning tea, her knitting needles silent for the moment, as her mind wove through the intricate pattern of clues gathered over the past days. The handkerchief, now confirmed by Inspector Craddock's laboratory report to bear traces of cyanide, stood as a silent accuser. Its delicate lace a testament to a mind both cunning and cruel. Yet the question of complicity gnawed at her. Clara Henshaw, with her bitter grudge and secretive London dealings, seemed the obvious architect. But Miss Marple's experience taught her that obviousness could be a trap, a sleight of hand masking deeper truths. To unravel this knot, she resolved to bring the threads together, to draw the players into her own domain, where her quiet presence could coax out the unguarded moments that betrayed guilt. She penned 4 brief invitations, each in her neat, unassuming hand, requesting the presence of Dr. Harold Vance, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, Miss Beatrice Lyle, and Mr. Rupert Grayson at her cottage that afternoon for tea. The pretext was simple, a gathering to share memories of Mrs. Ashford. a gesture of condolence that none could refuse without arousing suspicion. Yet Miss Marple's true purpose was to observe, to probe, to let the weight of the handkerchief's secret press upon them until one, or more, cracked under the strain. The invitations dispatched via the village boy, Miss Marple set about preparing her cottage, her movements as deliberate as her thoughts. The sitting room, with its chintz-covered chairs and lace doilies, was a stage of deceptive simplicity, its coziness a disarming contrast to the drama about to unfold. She arranged a tray with her best bone china, a teapot of Wedgwood blue, and a plate of scones baked that morning, their golden crusts exuding an aroma of homely comfort. The tea was her own blend, strong and untainted, poured from a pot she had scrubbed herself to ensure no suspicions lingered. A small fire crackled in the grate, casting a warm glow that softened the room's edges, but sharpened the stakes of the encounter. By 3 o'clock, the guests arrived, their footsteps hesitant on the garden path, as if each sensed the gravity of the summons. Dr. Vance entered first, his tweed suit rumpled, his cufflinks still, but his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Clara followed, her black morning dress severe, her face a mask of controlled composure, though her hands betrayed a faint tremor as she clutched her reticule. Beatrice, in a subdued navy frock that did little to dim her vibrancy, offered a nervous smile, her auburn curls pinned tightly, as if to restrain her usual exuberance. Rupert Grayson, last to arrive, was impeccable in a charcoal suit, his smile as polished as ever, though Miss Marple noted a tightness around his eyes, a wariness that belied his charm. "Welcome all," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and welcoming, as she gestured them to the chairs arranged in a semicircle around the tea table. "It's a sad occasion that brings us together, but I thought we might honour Lavinia by sharing our memories of her kindness and grace." Her tone was gentle, almost maternal, but her china blue eyes were as sharp as ever, missing nothing as the guests settled uneasily. The conversation began haltingly, with Dr. Vance clearing his throat to recount a time when Mrs. Ashford had funded a clinic for the village poor. "Most generous," he said, his voice gruff, though his fingers twitched toward his cufflinks, a gesture Miss Marple noted with interest. Beatrice chimed in with a story of a ball at the manor, her words bright but her eyes flickering toward Clara, as if gauging her rival's mood. Rupert spoke of Mrs. Ashford's acumen in managing her estate, his praise effusive, yet tinged with a lawyer's careful ambiguity. Clara, however, remained silent, her lips a thin line, her gaze fixed on the fire as if it held answers, or absolution. Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to unsettle. "It's curious," she said at last, her voice light as she passed a cup to Clara, "how small things can hold such significance. Lavinia's love of fine lace, for instance, that handkerchief she cherished, the one you gave her, Mrs. Henshaw, was so much a part of her. She used it so often, didn't she?" Her eyes met Clara's, mild but unyielding, and she noted the sudden tightening of the widow's grip on her reticule. Clara's response was clipped, her voice steady but strained. "It was a simple gift, Miss Marple. A token of our long acquaintance. Lavinia always liked pretty things." Her eyes darted away, and Miss Marple caught the faint flush creeping up her neck, a telltale sign of discomfort. "Indeed," Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational as she handed a cup to Beatrice, and such a thoughtful choice, knowing her habit of dabbing her lips. almost as if it were made for that purpose. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, and observed the ripple of unease that passed through the room. Dr. Vance's teacup clinked against its saucer, a faint tremor betraying his nerves. Beatrice's smile faltered, her fingers twisting a napkin into knots, while Rupert's polished facade remained intact, though his eyes narrowed slightly, as if recalculating his position. Beatrice, perhaps eager to deflect, spoke up, her voice a touch too bright. "Oh, Lavinia did love her little habits. I remember her saying how Clara knew her so well, better than anyone, really. Why, just last month, Clara was asking me about Lavinia's routines, said she wanted to surprise her with something special. I thought it was the handkerchief." Her words spilled out in a rush, and Miss Marple caught the glance she shot at Clara, a mix of innocence and accusation that did not go unnoticed. Clara's composure wavered, her eyes flashing with a spark of anger. "I meant only to please her," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the room's warmth. "It was a peace offering, nothing more." "You make too much of it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "A peace offering, how lovely! And yet so precise in its execution. I couldn't help but notice, Mrs. Henshaw, that you visited a chemist in London recently, for medicinal herbs, I believe you said." Her tone was mild, almost apologetic, but the question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through the group. Clara's face paled, her hands tightening further on her reticule. I don't see what that has to do with anything," she stammered, her voice rising. "I needed something for my nerves." "It's no secret I've been unwell, Dr. Vance." Perhaps sensing the mounting pressure, interjected, his voice unsteady. "Chemists sell all manner of things, Miss Marple. Herbs, tonics, nothing sinister in that." His cufflinks twitched, a nervous tick reborn, and Miss Marple noted the beads of sweat on his brow, a stark contrast to the room's cool air. "Quite so," she agreed, her smile serene. "But the handkerchief, you see, has been tested. The laboratory found traces of cyanide, faint but unmistakable. A curious choice for a gift, don't you think, when one knows it will be pressed to the lips so often?" Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of a verdict, and the room seemed to shrink, the fire's crackle the only sound as the guests absorbed the implication. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, though Miss Marple noted the theatricality of the gesture, as if rehearsed for such a moment. "Cyanide? Oh, Clara, you couldn't have!" Her voice trembled, but her eyes held a glint of calculation, as if weighing how to distance herself from the accusation. Rupert Grayson leaned forward, his smile gone, his voice low and measured. "Miss Marple, that's a grave accusation. Clara's no chemist, as you pointed out. Surely you're not suggesting she concocted such a scheme alone?" His tone was probing, as if testing the waters, and Miss Marple wondered if he sought to deflect suspicion or protect his own secrets. Clara's composure cracked like thin ice, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "This is outrageous!" "I gave her a handkerchief, nothing more. A gesture of goodwill, meant to mend old wounds. If there was poison, it wasn't my doing." Her hands shook now, the reticule slipping to the floor, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of panic in her eyes, a sign that the net was tightening. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her movements deliberate, letting the silence stretch. "It's curious, Mrs. Henshaw, how well you knew Lavinia's habits. You visited the manor at odd hours, I'm told, inquiring about her routines. And that parcel from the London chemist, handled so carefully, as if it held something precious or dangerous. Her voice remained soft, but each word was a needle, pricking at Clara's defences. Dr. Vance broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "Clara, if you knew something, say it now. We're all under suspicion here." His protest was vehement, but his eyes darted toward the door, as if he longed to flee the room's oppressive atmosphere. Beatrice, seizing the moment, leaned forward, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and accusation. "Yes, Clara, tell the truth. You were so angry with Lavinia. Those letters you showed me, full of venom. Did you do this?" Her words were accusatory, but her eyes held a plea, as if she feared her own complicity might surface. Rupert remained silent, his gaze fixed on Clara, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense, as if poised to deflect any accusation that might turn his way. Miss Marple, ever watchful, noted the interplay, the way each sought to protect their own secrets while casting blame on another. It was a dance she had seen before, in drawing rooms and village halls, where guilt unravelled under the pressure of scrutiny. Clara's resolve crumbled, her shoulders sagging as she buried her face in her hands. "It was meant to be a warning," she whispered, her voice muffled but audible in the hushed room. "I only wanted her to feel unwell, to reconsider the will. The chemist said it was safe in small doses, just enough to frighten her. I didn't know it would kill her." Her words spilled out, a torrent of confession laced with panic, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "A warning?" she asked softly, her tone inviting further revelation. "But you chose cyanide, Mrs. Henshaw, and you placed it in a gift you knew would be used intimately. You knew her habits, her trust in you. That is not the act of a warning, it is the act of a killer." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wild. "No! I swear I didn't mean to kill her. I only wanted what was mine, our family's legacy, stolen by her. She had everything, and I had nothing." Her voice broke, tears streaming down her face, and the room seemed to exhale, the tension shifting from suspense to resolution. Miss Marple turned to the others, her voice calm but commanding. "And you, Dr. Vance? Did you suspect the handkerchief's danger with your knowledge of poisons? Or you, Beatrice, did you know of Clara's plan, perhaps hoping to gain from Lavinia's demise? Mr. Grayson, did your legal manoeuvres conceal a darker intent?" Her questions hung in the air, each a probe into the shadows of their consciences. Dr. Vance shook his head vehemently, his voice hoarse. "I knew nothing of this. I'd never harm Lavinia. She saved my reputation. My debts, they're real, but I'm no murderer." His sincerity rang true, though Miss Marple noted the lingering fear in his eyes, perhaps of his own secrets being exposed. Beatrice's hands fluttered, her voice a whisper. "I suspected Clara was angry, but not this, not murder. I owed Lavinia, yes, but I thought we'd find another way." Her words faltered, her eyes darting to Rupert, as if seeking reassurance. Rupert Grayson cleared his throat, his voice measured but strained. "I assure you, Miss Marple, my dealings with Mrs. Ashford were above board. She spoke of altering her will. Yes, but I had no part in any foul play. Clara's actions are her own." His eyes met hers, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of calculation, as if he weighed the cost of further silence. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. Clara's confession, though incomplete, had laid bare the heart of the crime. A grudge nurtured into poison, a gift twisted into a weapon. Yet she sensed a final thread, a detail yet to surface. "Mrs. Henshaw," she said softly, "who supplied the cyanide? You are no chemist, as Mr. Grayson noted. Who aided you in this?" Clara's tears stopped, her face hardening into defiance. "No one," she spat. "I found the man myself in London. A chemist in a back alley, near Hatton Garden. He asked no questions, and I paid well. It was my plan, my doing." Her voice was steady now, a proud edge to it, as if claiming the act absolved her of its consequence. Miss Marple leaned back, satisfied. The confession was complete, the motive clear, greed and envy distilled into a deadly act. She rose, her movement slow but purposeful. "I think, my dear friends, it is time to inform Inspector Craddock. He will wish to hear this directly. Chapter 7. The confession." The confession hung in the air like the final note of a tragic symphony, echoing through Miss Marple's cosy sitting room with a resonance that silenced all but the crackling fire. Clara Henshaw's words, spilled in a rush of defiance and remorse, had stripped away the last veils of pretense, revealing the raw heart of the crime. The other guests, Dr. Vance, Beatrice Lyle, and Rupert Grayson, sat in stunned immobility. Their faces a canvas of emotions, relief at their own exoneration, horror at the revelation, and a lingering wariness, as if fearing the confession might ensnare them still. Miss Marple, standing by the tea-table with her hands clasped, observed them all with her unerring gaze, her mind already turning over the implications, the loose ends that, though minor, demanded tying. Clara's shoulders heaved with sobs now, her black mourning dress seeming to swallow her slight frame, making her appear smaller, more fragile than the sharp-tongued widow Miss Marple had first encountered at the tea-party. "You don't understand," Clara whispered, her voice muffled by her hands. "Lavinia took everything from me. My cousin's fortune was meant to be shared. Family blood runs thick, or so I thought. But she hoarded it, flaunted it, while I scraped by on crumbs. The handkerchief. It was to be a lesson, not a sentence. The chemist assured me. Small doses, he said. How was I to know her habit would make it lethal?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, a soothing counterpoint to Clara's anguish, but it carried the inexorable force of truth. "Habits, Mrs. Henshaw, are the threads that weave our lives, and you knew hers intimately. You visited the manor under cover of night, inquired about her routines from the gardener, from Beatrice. You chose lace from Brussels, exquisite and personal, ensuring it would be cherished and used, and the cyanide, procured from that disreputable alley in London, near Hatton Garden, where shadows trade in death as casually as jewellers in diamonds. It was no accident. It was calculation, born of resentment that festered like a wound untreated. Beatrice, her theatrical flair subdued now into genuine tremor, leaned forward, her emerald eyes wide with a mix of fascination and fear. But Clara, why not confront her? Lavinia was kind. She lent me money when no one else would. If you'd asked, perhaps. Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the subtle shift in her posture, a straightening as if shedding the weight of suspicion. Clara lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed but burning with a fierce light. Kind? To you, perhaps, because you flattered her, danced to her tune. But to me, her cousin's widow, she was a thief in silk, parading what should have been mine. The will. My cousin promised me a share, But Lavinia twisted it, claimed it all. Those letters I kept, they proved it, but what good are words against a lawyer's ink? Her gaze flicked to Rupert, who shifted uncomfortably, his slick charm cracking under the accusation. Rupert cleared his throat, his voice smooth but edged with caution. Mrs. Henshaw, I handled the estate with utmost integrity. Mrs. Ashford's instructions were clear. Any changes were her decision alone. If you felt wronged, the courts were open to you. His eyes met Miss Marple's, and she saw the calculation there. A man accustomed to navigating legal mazes, now wary of the moral one unfolding before him. Dr. Vance, his face ashen, finally spoke, his hands still for the first time, clasped tightly in his lap. Clara, this is madness. Lavinia saved me from ruin, hushed that malpractice suit, kept my name clean. I owed her my life in a way. If I'd known, but I didn't. My own debts, yes, they pressed, but murder? Never. His voice broke, and Miss Marple discerned the truth in his words. A man haunted by past mistakes, but not this one. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet authority. Indeed, Doctor, your loyalty to Lavinia was evident, even in your nervousness at the tea. The cufflinks, gold, engraved with initials not your own. Perhaps a memento from that hushed scandal? But no, your hands are clean of this poison. As are yours, Miss Lyle. Your debts were a motive, true, but your flirtations with Mr. Grayson suggest a different path to security. Alliance, perhaps, rather than assassination. Beatrice flushed, her hands fluttering to her throat. We spoke of marriage, yes, but nothing more. Lavinia's death, it changes everything, but I swear, I knew nothing of Clara's plan. Rupert's nod was subtle, a silent confirmation, and Miss Marple filed it away. The pieces fitting neatly now, turning back to Clara, Miss Marple's voice softened further, drawing the woman out like a confessor in a dimly lit chapel. Tell us, Mrs. Henshaw, the full tale, from the beginning, how the grudge took root, the London journey, the chemist's shadowed deal. The truth, unvarnished, will lighten the burden, even as justice claims its due. Clara drew a shuddering breath, her defiance crumbling into weary resignation. It started years ago, when my husband, Lavinia's cousin, died at sea. The fortune was his, built on shipping ventures, but the will named Lavinia as sole heir, with a pittance for me. I confronted her, begged for fairness, but she laughed it off, said it was his wish. The letters, his letters to me, hinted otherwise, promises of provision. I kept them, nursed them like wounds, letting the bitterness grow. When she announced changes to her will, favouring Beatrice or that solicitor, I snapped. I went to London, sought out a man known in certain circles, a chemist who dealt in remedies for life's injustices. He provided the compound, instructed me on its application. Soak the lace, let it dry, the residue invisible but potent on contact with moisture. I embroidered it myself, the forget-me-nots a cruel irony. At the tea, when she pressed it to her lips so often, I watched, waiting for illness, not death. The room was silent, the confession a spellbinding narrative that held them captive. Miss Marple, her mind absorbing every detail, probed deeper. And the dose? You said it was small, yet it killed. Did the chemist deceive you, or was your hand heavier than intended? Clara's eyes glazed, lost in memory. He warned of risks, but I thought I measured carefully. Perhaps her habit amplified it, those lingering presses, inhaling the fumes. I didn't know, I swear. When she collapsed, I froze, realizing the horror. But it was too late. Her voice faded, the fire's pop the only punctuation. Miss Marple rose, her movements graceful, signalling the end. A tragic tale, Mrs. Henshaw, born of envy that poisoned more than lace. The inspector must hear this. Justice demands it. She moved to the telephone, her call brief, the authorities summoned with quiet efficiency. As they waited, the guests stirred, the spell broken. Dr. Vance offered Clara a handkerchief, ironically clean, his gesture one of pity. Beatrice wept softly now, genuine tears for a benefactress lost. Rupert stood, his composure regained, perhaps already plotting legal defences. Miss Marple, observing all, felt the familiar mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Justice served, but at the cost of a soul shattered. Inspector Craddock arrived swiftly, his team discreet, taking Clara into custody with minimal fuss. Her face, pale but defiant, held a strange peace as she was led away, whispering, "It's over." The others dispersed, their steps heavy on the garden path, the weight of revelation lingering. Alone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the needles clicking once more. "People are so careless with the little things," she murmured, her eyes on the away-ish fading light. In St. Mary Mead, the little things were the keys to great mysteries, and Jane Marple, the quiet guardian, had unlocked another.